Hey everybody, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. So really excited about this webinar, Strategies to Prevent the Impacts of Free-Ranging Domestic Cats. We have two very knowledgeable speakers, Elizabeth Gao and Sara Schweitzer from Canada and the United States. So we'll get some good perspectives here. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, tuning in from BC, Elizabeth Gao. Dr. Gao is a research scientist in the Wildlife Research Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada, based out of Delta, BC, and currently adjunct professor at University of Guelph, Fraser University, and McMaster Universities. So her research incorporates interdisciplinary team approaches and focuses on understanding where, when, and how migratory bird populations are declining. She's a leading expert and researcher on the ecology and behavior of wandering cats in Canada. And overall, her research team aims to make the world a better place for birds, people, and cats. And for the next 20 to 30 minutes or so, Elizabeth will discuss the effects of free-ranging domestic cats on wildlife and the environment and the work that the Gao research team is up to. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And Elizabeth, I'll pass things over to you.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to talk about a little bit about cats and a bit of background on them, and then I'm going to talk a bit about my research on cats and what my students, myself, have been doing. I've been working on cats. I started as a postdoctoral fellow, Libre Aero postdoctoral fellow, about 7 years ago. Now time flies very quickly, so I forget how long, but it's been a little while. And so things have developed in Canada in terms of research and also a little bit on the landscape, which I'll talk a little bit about near the end of my talk. So domestic cats are very closely related to African wildcats. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because the domestic cats that we have today in our homes and our streets and so on have many of the same traits, almost all the same traits as their ancestors, the African wildcats. And they evolved about 10,000 years ago, which doesn't sounds like a long time, but evolutionary timescales, that's not. So that means that the domestic cats we have the same hunting characteristics and same sort of demands and needs as a lot of African wildcats, so their ancestors. And because of these wild links, a group in the UK has coined domestic cats wild companions, which I think really describes them very, very well because historically and even currently, maybe less so in Canada with pest controllers, although they're still used in rural areas, cats have these dual societal roles where they are companion animals that are snuggling up with us in our beds and live in our homes. But they also historically have roles as pest controllers, mainly for mice, and that's actually how they started to come over to North America. Was they're brought over on ships for rat and mouse control. And so domestic cats, unlike a lot of other domestic animals, they have these sort of multiple different types of cats. I think of dogs, they at least in North America tend to be mainly all indoor, that we take outside on leashes and are relatively controlled. But for domestic cats, it's much, much different. We have cats that never go outside unless maybe they're on a leash or in a catio. And then there's cats that are what we often call indoor outdoor cats that are put outside. And so people may spay or neuter them, they may provide them food, but really don't have control over their movement or generally reproduction if they're not spayed or neutered. And then what sometimes called free ranging or basically indoor outdoor cats also could be called free ranging. But in this terms, what we often call free ranging cats in North America are like colony cats or neighborhood cats. They're these cats that don't have owners and that basically live on the street. And sometimes people put out some food. Sometimes they're spay or neutered through trap neuter release programs. But they have completely uncontrolled movement related to people. So they can freely move across the landscape. And then we have feral cats, which are cats that do not have anything controlling them. They're actually completely feral and are not provided with any resources from people. And there's probably very few of actual fully feral cats in Canada, much more common in places like Australia where there's a major feral cat problem. But in North America, most of the cats that we see are probably more in these, so what on this chart is called free ranging. So these semi-owned or receive some provisioning from humans. And so what I'll be talking about today and where the really challenges are these cats that are allowed outdoors. And we have to think about them in these sort of different terms, that there's a lot of different types, and I say types of cats, not different breeds, but different types of cats based on their husbandry and their ownership. And so when we look at this, the cats that have the least impact on wildlife, and in terms of thinking about invasive species, are these cats that have some control by human. The more control by human, the less of an impact that they have, although they still have some impacts. And so we see lots of influence of humans versus less. And it's much easier to manage when we're managing humans than when we're trying to manage free roaming like cats that don't have any relationship with humans. And when I say easy, it's not actually that easy, but on the spectrum, it's easier versus harder. Now, there's a lot of benefits to allowing cats to roam, and maybe some of you have cats that you put outside, and there's a lot of reasons for this, and there's a lot of advocates towards allowing cats to roam freely because they're able to engage in these natural behaviors. And the reason I told you about African wildcats is because those natural behaviors are those ancestral traits that cats need to have in their life to be able to fulfill their body's desires and their body's needs. And so putting cats outside allow them to climb, and they allow them to scratch, they allow them to hunt, which is a natural behavior, allow them to spray, and all the different things that they need in terms of exercise by wandering around. And this can reduce unwanted behaviors in the home. And additionally, we often forget that cats in neighborhoods often provide people connection to nature that they aren't getting otherwise. So cities have sort of removed a lot of nature, and sometimes the only connection that people have are to the cats that wander around their neighborhood. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of negatives to allowing cats to roam. And some of these may exceed the benefits, particularly in terms of ecological benefits. Cats kill many wild animals, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds. They face numerous welfare threats and risks, such as coyotes that frequently eat and kill cats. I'm based out in British Columbia. There's cougars that also eat cats quite regularly. And cats also are hit by cars a lot. There's a lot more mortality than I think a lot of people see. I know almost every day when I'm out early in the morning driving, I'll see a cat somewhere. Sometimes they're crossing roads, sometimes they're not. They also are very costly for society. There's been some recent papers, quite high profile in science, and I think nature as well, that classify the different impacts of invasive species, and cats are listed under as one of the species. And they're often usually in the top like 3. And this is a figure on the far left that shows that their impacts and costs of society are third only to mosquitoes and rats. And I think mice as well is in that category. So the cumulative cost of allowing cats for free roam is quite high. The other thing is that cats can spread disease. They can spread disease from the animals that they capture or animals that they're around to humans, and they also can spread disease to other cats. And so this is one of the things that's happening. We're seeing with avian flu, where cats may be consuming meat, so it's raw chicken or even birds that may have avian flu, and then they might be transmitting it into other animals. And then cats are also quite susceptible to getting various viruses and so on from people that then can get transferred into the wildlife population. So overall, in Canada, I just wanted to highlight this because there was some work done just over a decade ago that showed that domestic cats are the #1 leading cause of bird mortality in Canada, estimated to kill then about 100 to 350 million birds a year, which is quite a large number. And it's higher than building collisions of glass. It's higher than power lines, all these other factors. And these are the measurable sources of mortality. This is not, forget that there are other things that also harm birds. But cats, as far as things that we can directly measure, and in government speak, we call this incidental take, that cats are the #1 source of bird mortality in Canada. But it's not the cat's fault in all cases. It's really human behaviors that are affecting the number of cats. And what we have is this problem where there's too many cats outside. And it's, again, these cats that are not owned by people. And so a single cat, very quickly, they reproduce. They often will have 2 litters a year, or about 2 litters every 14 months or so. When they're about 5 or 6 months, they can have their first litter. And so if a single cat is left not spay or neutered, so a female cat, she can have 4 kittens that then in under 2 years equal over 30 kittens. So very, very rapidly, a single cat can produce a lot of offspring. And unfortunately, our shelter systems and so on are not able to deal with the demand of the volume of cats that are often found, particularly in urban areas. And this means that once populations of animals grow very large, it can be quite complicated and challenging to control them. And cat management is extremely complicated because we're working at these different types of cats. We have cats that are moving through shelter systems. We have cats that don't have owners. We have cats that have owners that are going outside, that are reproducing. There's a lot of different factors. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can manage cats. And I'm not going to go into all the different ways, but there's things that focus on human behavior that focus on the own cats. So cats that people put outside or cats that people own. So some things that we say to do is that, hey, when you get a kitten, maybe if you want to take it outside, you learn to leash, have it on a leash, or you right off the start, don't allow it outdoor access. It's much harder to train an older cat, for instance. When we talk about cats that are unowned, we get into these population control type measures. And so this is where there's a lot of controversy between lethal control versus non-lethal control. And current non-lethal control measures, such as trap, neuter, release or trap, neuter, vaccinate, release, they put cats back into the environment, which makes it which is another problem where we aren't necessarily seeing these massive population decreases. And cats are still able to cause those sort of negative effects on the environment. And so one of the challenges of cats as well is not only are they complicated to manage, but there's a lot of different groups that are very interested and concerned about cats. It's not just ecologists, environmentalists, although we're very more concerned about the negative impacts of cats in the environment. But there's veterinarians and welfare workers and so on that are quite interested and worried about domestic cats for various different reasons. And so one of the approaches that we've taken in Canada, and this has been going on for probably almost a decade now, is trying to build collaborative dialogue. And so we've used some different approaches, a concept called translational ecology, that is a set of basically 6 principles or stages that are non-linear, they're circular, so they can occur at any time, which involves trying to create collaboration of people that are engaged for long times and have these sort of open relationships that then provide some standards of communication. How are we going to create an agenda? How are we sort of agree to disagree? And then some general processes or goals that are developed with all the different people at the table. And this allows us to see, what do we actually want? What do all these different groups have in common? And where can we find common ground to direct research or direct other things or potentially policies? So what these interest groups have what has come out of some of these things is not only we come up with some collaboration agreements on how we agree to agree or not to agree on things, but also directing some of the research that we need. And one of the things that has been of interest is, are there free roaming cats in our community? Municipalities and people want to know, how many, where are those cats? What can we actually do to reduce them? And is it really a problem? And then if we do anything, are our efforts effective? It's very expensive and time consuming and costly. And so making sure that those efforts are actually effective. And how do we know if cats are killing birds in our community? So actually seeing, are they killing birds or are they doing anything to other species? And are cats killing native species or birds or species at risk? And so my research has really focused on these sort of 2 aspects of where are cats, how many, providing and creating some guidelines on how we can measure numbers of cats, and then seeing what cats are capturing and killing. And so I've worked in a number of different cities. This is just an example of 3 of the cities that my team has worked with over the past 7 or 8 years. We worked in Vancouver, Gatineau, and in the South Okanagan, which is where there's a lot of species at risk. And and long story short, when I look at all these different studies, there's certain nuances between different places, but cats are extremely prolific in urban areas. And when we think about birds or other animals and their impacts, and this is where their ecological impacts, there are some places where they're bigger than others, even though the number of cats or the density of cats may be similar across a lot of cities in Canada. Some places may have bigger impacts. And for instance, in Vancouver in the winter, there's a lot of birds. And there's also almost double the number of cats in the winter than the summer, which I'm not quite sure. We haven't quite figured out why that is. But it might just be that the weather is actually more favorable for people putting their cats outside in the winter in Vancouver. And in the South Okanagan, which is we're talking about right down by the US border, or from Okanagan Falls down to Soyuz, if you're familiar with that area, birds are funneling through that area through migration, and they funnel through in the winter. They spend a lot of time there. And so the cats are certainly a huge risk to birds at certain times of the year or throughout the year in areas where birds congregate, for instance. And so the next part of the question is, what are animals capturing? And so my graduate student, Jonathan Chu, who's a PhD student at the University of Guelph, has been working on this question that I started actually many years ago, but it took a long time for us to develop technology to actually get at these types of questions. So we're putting tiny little cameras onto just below the chin of the cat. You can see a photo of a cat with a little camera. We call them cat cams. And they allow us to see what the cats see. We get these images of them walking around the neighborhood, and then what specifically the types of animals that they're capturing. So I think this is a vole, we have a robin and a chipmunk here. And so Jonathan and a large team of undergraduate students get to go through lots of cat videos. And we don't see cat videos like you may see on the internet. The cat videos we see are more realistic, and unfortunately, some of them can be a little bit disturbing. So the next image I'm going to show you is can be a little bit disturbing. It is footage from one of our cameras of a cat that is up in a tree that is found a nest of robin nest. So you can see the cat's chin is at the top, and that's where the camera is. And so the cat is up in the tree, and it has found a nest, and it actually ate all the nestlings. So I think it actually ate a couple nestlings when it was in the tree, and then it brought a couple down onto the ground and then finished eating them. And so we can use this footage from the videos to get an idea of what animals cats are hunting. And Jonathan's are working on this in Guelph as well as in the South Okanagan to correspond with some of the work that we've been doing with population estimates of cats. And so in the city of Guelph, or around Guelph, we also worked in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. There are 48 cats that we studied. These are all cats that people put outside. And we monitored about 114 hours of each cat with these cameras. And 69% of cats hunted at least once, which is quite a large number. So although many people will say, oh, my cat doesn't hunt, well, majority of them do. And we recorded 138 total predation events. And it was a lot of mammals. Majority of the animals were mammals, a few invertebrates. And so these are often moths or large grasshoppers or a pile of different other insects, a few birds. And I think there was like one reptile, one amphibian, one frog, and one snake. And so we can use information about how many cats are in cities. And for instance, in Guelph, a colleague of mine, Tyler Flockhart, counted the number of cats in Guelph, estimated them to be around 7,600 or so. And then we can take those estimates that we have to get these citywide estimates of predation rates. And so at the city of Guelph, only between June and October, which is when we actually collected data, we see that cats are likely coming around. These are rough estimates, so there's a lot of variation around them. Over 700,000 animals, majority of the mammals, 500,000 mammals, 130,000 invertebrates, 60,000 birds, and a fair number of amphibians and reptiles. And so this shows the magnitude of the impacts on sort of these small scales that could give us an idea of, how big of a problem cats are ecologically in an area. In addition, one of my past graduate students, Miley Pilot, she was working on looking at home ranges in cats. So on these little cameras, we also have little GPS trackers, and we use those GPS trackers to get an idea of home range. And home range is important because that can tell us about sort of how isolated those ecological impacts are. It's one thing to get information about the numbers of animals that cats are killing, but also how isolated those are. Are cats going a long ways, or are they staying close to home? And some cats stayed very close to home, only covering areas a few houses away, while others went several blocks. And there's a lot of work that's been done about home ranges of cats. It's relatively easy to look at it. And a group in the UK, in case I all, has looked at these impacts on a broad scale across multiple different countries. And what they show that we also show is that, domestic cats have these very small home ranges, and so they're really amplified on their impacts. And although they have similar prey rates of capture to wild carnivores or other similar cats, and they did a comparative analysis in this study, the impacts of that, because they're so isolated, for instance, a domestic cat has a very small home range compared to a wild cat or a jungle cat, for instance, that they talked about in their study. And so a wild cat has a huge home range and has the same amount of animals that they're killing as a domestic cat that has a very isolated range. So right around one's home, there's a very concentrated amount of predation from a cat. And when we look at the magnitudes of this, when there's many, many cats in a neighborhood, for instance, that predation pressure can be very intensified on certain areas. And so this is why I think one of the biggest concerns we have is, thinking about cities or areas in the country that have these big impacts, potentially high impacts on biodiversity loss, or areas of high wildlife abundance. So I talked about Vancouver having super high abundance of birds in the winter. And this is a concern because there's cats sort of throughout the city. There's upwards of maybe around 80 to 100,000 cats in the city of Vancouver. And the South Okanagan, where we have extremely high densities of cats per people. There's almost as many cats as people in that region. There's a lot of species at risk. And we certainly have seen on our footage, we've seen cats capturing yellow-breasted chats and western skink, which are species at risk in BC and I think federally as well. And there's also pallid bats that overlap quite extensively with some of the areas that cats we've observed cats. So this raises some questions about, are cats invasive species or non-native species? Well, it's really complex and complicated. They have rapid reproduction. They're a mesopredator that has been introduced by humans, although very intentionally introduced. They can survive about people on a wide variety of prey. Native species have not evolved defense mechanisms. So even though cats have been in North America for 4,000 years, they still, native species don't really have natural defense, or they haven't evolved defense mechanisms against cats. And globally, cats have caused the extinction of 36 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles, mainly on islands, and they can spread disease. But the complexity comes because cats are partially domesticated and can be pets. And people have strong emotional ties to cats as well that further make it more complex. There's ethical and welfare considerations and a human responsibility to care for animals that comes down into these welfare considerations. So how is this approach, what's been done in other places in Canada? I work a lot with the Stewardship Center for British Columbia, and they have a whole cats and birds component and campaign they've had for about a decade. And they've really been organizing a lot of those sort of groups and collaborative groups that I've talked about to help decide what types of research to do. And so they have a whole Cats and Birds website that they've really focused on, cats are certainly a serious threat, but we're working collaboratively. We're thinking about other people's perceptions and so on in their messaging. The Canadian Veterinary Medical Association, veterinarians are huge stakeholders and important in communicating to the public about domestic cats. They also have a whole position statement that took a long time actually to get in place that talks about particularly the feral cats, but again, focuses on this evidence approach of recognizing the complexity of cats, the welfare risk, as well as their ecological impacts. Nature Canada used to have a large cats and birds campaign, but has now shifted into a bird-friendly cities approach where there's a certification program for cities get this bird-friendly certification, and cats are one of those components that cities have to show that they're doing something to reduce the number of cats to get this bird-friendly certification. And so here's an example of the city of London that is actually taking a fair bit of action on cats. They have, this is from their website, they portray cats a little bit like negatively on their website, but also, I think is a force that says, we have to think about them and their impacts that they have on nature, which is related to birds. So when we think about managing cats, and I mentioned this earlier, it's thinking about keeping cats safe from roaming unsupervised. And there's lots of ways and important things we have to think about. I work with a lot of welfare scientists, and we use the footage that we have from the cameras to look at how we can create environments indoors for cats. So putting cats on leashes, it takes a while to teach them, training them with toys and getting to engage in these natural behaviors, and then creating things like catios where cats can go outside and roam in a safe environment in like a yard. And so some final conclusions and thoughts. Human relationships with cats are very historically complex, and thinking about them as wild companions. And the effects on cats and wildlife are very restricted to certain areas right around people, but they're amplified. They're magnitudes more than a wild species. And cats are also recognized as an invasive species by the IUCN. And because of these impacts, ecological impacts. But there's a lot of challenges surrounding cats that we need to conclude and consider the values and views of a lot of different interested parties. We're thinking about management, we're thinking about all kinds of aspects related to cats. So that is all I have now, and hopefully there's a few minutes for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was a really eye-opening presentation. I had no idea kind of the numbers that of wildlife that cats were impacting, especially that case study you did in that research project you did in Guelph.
Yep.
I had a question about that. So the cats that you studied, they were indoor-outdoor cats. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. They were indoor
so
outdoor cats. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
if they were a cat population that was completely feral, would those numbers be drastically higher? Like
They
cats that
would
aren't
likely
fed and
be, yeah, they'd likely be much higher. And we don't have a lot of work on that in Canada or North America, but some of the work in Australia shows it can be quite impactful. There's cats that they look at stomach contents because they euthanize a lot of cats. They hunt the feral cats, and so they're finding. I think there's one case study where a single cat had something like 90 bats in its stomach. So that's just a 24-hour period. So some cats are quite prolific in their hunting, particularly when they're using it to survive.
yikes. Yeah, not good. Thank you so much for that presentation. If anyone has any questions for Elizabeth, please throw them in the Q&A. We have a couple here. Let's see. We have one from Colleen. Thanks for being here, Colleen. She's wondering if could speak a bit on managed cat colonies in Canada, or if you know of any work being done on managed cat colonies, maybe in BC.
Yeah, managed cat colonies are a little bit complex. When you look at colonies, the current management involves often someone who's like a caretaker on the colony that's providing them food. There is some evidence that providing cats food can reduce the number of animals that they hunt. Um, and ideally, all of those cats are spayed or neutered, but that doesn't always happen. And they also would have veterinary care. Again, that doesn't always happen. But it's quite management of cats is extremely complicated because you always have cats coming into the population. So people are like abandoning cats, or they don't spay any of their cats that they put outside, and so you have new kittens sort of coming all the time. So unless a colony is completely isolated, which doesn't really happen, it's very hard to reduce the population of those colonies over time, unless you're looking at large numbers of the entire sort of cat population being spayed or neutered.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely complicated.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. We have a question about the references. I see on some of your slides you have a reference at the bottom. Could you maybe
Yeah.
share those references with me? or maybe even
Yep.
in the chat. I
Yeah.
think some folks would find that helpful.
Yeah. I can type, I probably can type them in the answer and see the and type answers. So I can probably do that.
Oh, sweet. Um, Beautiful. I accidentally pressed answered, so I don't know if you could still respond to
Yeah.
that. Let's see. Colleen has another question. She's interested in non-lethal ways that cats impact birds and the environment, and if there's any research on the non-lethal impacts birds have or cats have, like how roaming cats create landscapes that fear
Yeah.
affecting bird nesting and feeding behavior, things like that.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that because my research hasn't specifically looked at it, but there's a body of research that does look at just the presence of cats and how, a lot of birds do see them as predators. And so instead of feeding their young, they'll spend an hour, alarm calling because there's a cat in the neighborhood. And so that has sort of indirect effects on behavior of birds. There's also concern about concepts of ecological traps, in particular in cities, where it may be cats that are creating those. So birds are often attracted to habitats in cities because the environment makes something that they evolutionarily see as beneficial. But then you introduce a cat to that system, and suddenly that environment is no longer safe for that bird, and so it can influence the number of young that they have based on that. So they may be some birds may be brought like may want to breed in the area, and then unfortunately, a cat can make that an unsafe place.
Yeah, I could see that being a very big deal in more urban areas.
Yeah.
Um, awesome. And then we have a question on trap and release programs and how kind of if you could talk a bit about trap and release and how effective they are, if you know.
Yeah, I'm not a huge expert on trap and release programs because I don't really work with them, but I know they are done in a number of communities. There's a few different variations of them. Usually, their cats are trapped. They're brought into vets. They're assessed for various health. They're vaccinated, and they're sometimes released back to the same colony. Sometimes they're just thrown out on the street randomly. Other times, the cats are rehomed, and so some of the really good trap release programs really look at which cats can be rehomed versus which ones can't. But I often I've heard trap near release programs being thought of a bit like shelters on the street because cats can't be managed in shelters. So we have to put them on the street because there's just not the resources.
Yeah, rehoming would be ideal, but there's not enough homes, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Sweet. I think we'll do one more question and then move on to our next one. Cool. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I think we're going to pause questions for now. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great presentation, very eye-opening. Awesome. I'm happy to introduce our second speaker tuning in from North Carolina. Dr. Sara Schweitzer is an assistant chief of the Division of Wildlife Management within the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and she oversees the Wildlife Diversity Program for the state agency. There are 20 biologists working throughout North Carolina on conservation efforts around birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. In addition to coordinating surveys, monitoring research, and habitat conservation projects with their staff and partners, Sara's involved in several partnership programs, committees, and working groups, including bird conservation, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, land bird raptor, shorebird, and waterbird committees, U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan, and many more. She's also a co-leader working on revitalizing the Waterbird Council and updating the Waterbird Conservation Initiatives Plan. So now, related to this webinar, Sara also chairs the Feral and Free-Ranging Cat Working Group for the Bird Conservation Committee of AFWA from 2016 to 2022. The working group produced several products, including a toolkit to address free-ranging domestic cats on agency lands, and this was published in 2024. And Sara will spend the next little while talking about her work and the toolkit. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Sara, you can take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, and Elizabeth's presentation was great because it covers a lot of the topics that we went over in this working group. And so let me give you a quick overview of the agenda, what I'll cover, a little bit of introduction, background, the chapters in the toolkit that we put together. And then if we have any time, we can go over some questions and answers. But as an introduction and some background, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is an association filled with state agencies and federal agencies, including the Canadian Wildlife Service, but also a lot of NGOs. So we work together in committees, and as Chris mentioned, I'm on the Bird Conservation Committee. And then within each of the committees, we have working groups that address various concerns. So in our Bird Conservation Committee, I was chair of our non-game bird working group. And within that, we identify certain threats we want to address as agencies and NGOs. And so the threat that you all just heard about, and we'll talk about today, from free-ranging cats was one that was really significant, and we wanted to see what we could do to address that concern. So we did, and like Elizabeth was mentioning, we went through some of the impacts in particular to birds. So on this figure, the birds, mammals, and reptiles are indicated here, and it indicates that cats are a significant impact to bird species globally. They've led to the extinction of 63 species of birds, mammals, and reptiles worldwide. And one of the most well-known cat extinctions occurred, the Stevens Island wren, shown up here in New Zealand, which was a totally avoidable event. So it was a really sad extinction of a unique species. You'll see in this graph also the breakdown of 430 threatened, endangered, and extinct bird, mammal, and reptile species at risk from cats. And this is only slightly higher than the next invasive predator group of rodents at 420 species. So clearly a significant impact. Then this table shows a breakdown of cat-caused mortality by year from different publications. And Elizabeth referred to this as well. These numbers, and for Canada here from Blanchard, is about 204 million birds killed per year. But down in the US, it's up to 2.4 billion birds per year and 12.3 billion mammals per year. So clearly a significant effect on wildlife. And not only direct impact, and Elizabeth mentioned this also, that indirect impacts from cats can be great as well. So these indirect impacts can be from competition for resources, that fear effect that you're talking about, and also introduction of diseases into the environment. And again, this was so significant that the IUCN and the U.S. Western Governors Association have recognized domestic cats to be among the most harmful invasive species globally and in the U.S. So in our toolkit and the monograph that resulted from it, we break down these different threats into different chapters, and we put them in this order so that they would not only be integrated, but also people could pull from the different chapters as needed for the work that they were involved with. This is also focusing on agencies. So this is for lands that are managed for native wildlife and habitats by federal and state agencies, but it could be lands that are managed by NGOs too, like Ducks Unlimited or the Nature Conservancy or other land managers. So hopefully we're helping land managers for native wildlife and natural resources. The chapter on domestic cat diseases approaches this from a One Health perspective, and this recognizes that we're all interconnected and we're linked. So humans, domestic animals, wildlife, and fish are all in our shared environment. And free-ranging domestic cats can present disease concerns due to health and welfare risks, not only to cats and other felids, but also on impact of health and welfare of other species and the environment. Many agencies now are taking this One Health approach, and within this, it's really important that there's engagement among veterinary and medical professionals, wildlife stewards, and land managers. And this approach is really warranted for this risk of disease from domestic cats. In the toolkit, we break down and talk about the various diseases that may be introduced by domestic cats. They generally experience a higher risk of viral, bacterial, fungal, and parasitic diseases due to their free-ranging behavior and the uncontrolled environmental interactions that they have. Domestic cat diseases can be transmitted by pathogens in the environment, so in the soil, water, or air, or through direct contact, and many are zoonotic and result in public health consequences. So understanding the routes of pathogen transmission of these diseases is critical to developing intervention strategies that prevent or mitigate disease exposure risks. So aerosol transmitted diseases include coronaviruses, such as the SARS-CoV-2 virus that resulted in the COVID pandemic. Vector-borne diseases result from exposure to fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes, especially for domestic cats without routine preventative pesticide treatments. And examples of these include plague, tularemia, and tapeworms, which are transmitted by fleas, and ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, and Lyme disease, which are transmitted by ticks. Of course, there's oral or direct contact as well. And these are in the forms of bites, scratches, or skin abrasions. And these are routes of transmission of viral diseases, such as rabies, feline leukemia virus, feline immunodeficiency virus, or FIV, as well as bacterial diseases and fungal diseases like ringworm. So many of these do pose a significant public health risk and can be spread to other domestic and wild animals. And rabies in particular is a preventable disease by prophylactic vaccination of animals and to people at risk of exposure, such as all of our biologists who work with bats and other mammals that have rabies vaccinations. But approximately 5,000 animals per year test positive for rabies in the United States. One of the concerns specifically for felines and domestic cats is the transmission of Toxoplasma gondii. And it's a protozoan parasite that affects felines and domestic cats, but it can be a direct or indirect infection to not only themselves, so auto infection, or other animals and people. People are primarily infected by consuming infected tissues and undercooked meat, or from exposure of oocyst contaminated environments, so the eggs from the parasite. Recent studies have found that rainfall and runoff have contributed to oocyst contamination of aquatic marine systems, including resulting in subclinical, latent, or lethal infections in wildlife. So these have found losses of marine mammals and otters and to bivalves as well. So the diversity of infection pathways and variety of at-risk species really requires a One Health approach to this concern. So all these details are in that chapter on diseases, and there's also an appendix that elaborates on some of the diseases that can affect cats, and that can be zoonotic as well. The next chapter is on legal issues, and y'all touched on this briefly. But there has been litigation over trap, neuter, release. There's a growing body of case law on the issue, and this monograph and toolkit gives many examples of this case law to be you can look at for examples. And in most of our states or state agencies, we haven't delegated authority to regulate feral cats. And many of the states that we survey don't have explicit policy on feral cats. So we probably need to put into law some of these regulations and statutes. There have been some conflicts that we elaborate on in the monograph. Another issue is that many state agencies have environmental review requirements. So if there are some concerns about disease transmission and other issues that pop up, agencies might start getting involved in these issues too. We also have jurisdiction over the Endangered Species Act, so state agencies and federal agencies. And so if there is an impact on endangered species relative to a TNR colony or some other situation, those legal situations could come into play. We have a whole section on human dimensions, and this is super helpful to have input on this toolkit from people who are sociologists and human dimensions specialists, because in this situation, humans are both the cause or the source and the solution of this issue. There's also a real diversity of stakeholder thoughts on the topic. There are no simple solutions, and every situation is different. So when approaching this issue, and in our case, it's on agency or lands managed for native wildlife and natural environments, you need to engage with social scientists early when you begin this work. But the social scientists who helped us with this toolkit or monograph provided a bunch of recommendations that are elaborated further in the document. But in summary, they suggested that you need to determine which human behaviors are leading to domestic cats in the area of interest. So what is happening in that area? You need to avoid making assumptions about the stakeholders. So you really need to engage to learn what these actions are. And you need to focus on management on areas of consensus, so find common ground and focus there. It's also good to construct messages that appeal to these shared values and this common ground. And Elizabeth mentioned earlier the different terms that are used to describe cats, and that's going to be really important to understand what situation you're dealing with and what are the risks associated with the cats of concern. And then it's super important to form really productive partnerships. And we have a chapter I'll talk about in a minute on partnerships and how to form them. And part of this whole work is also education and outreach. And the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has a committee on education and outreach. And they produce all sorts of products on wildlife and fisheries. And one of the products they've produced is Flying Wild, and it's about migratory birds. And so they're trying to teach teachers and naturalists and others to bring this to the classroom about migratory birds, but they've added a threat of free-ranging cats into one of their products. It's an exercise where they challenge the participants to go through a migratory process, and they've included cats as one of the factors that they may face along the migratory pathway, which is a great way to introduce this topic to educators. Another group that does great outreach is American Bird Conservancy. And Grant Sizemore, he's the invasive species biologist for American Bird Conservancy. They put together a great program with cats indoors, and you can find this online. And these products include solutions to the issue, such as the catios or enclosures, using harnesses, strollers, or backpacks, indoor enrichment, and also they provide suggestions on anti-predator devices. They produce brochures, and they also have a pledge online. And research has shown that people who sign a pledge to keep their cats indoors or keep their cats under human control really are going to act on that much better than those who don't physically make a pledge. So that's been a really neat project right there. They also do a lot of advocacy, and they have an e-newsletter. We talked about just a second ago, the Cats and Birds program from Nature Canada, which also has a lot of outreach, lesson plans, and it sounds like they're doing great work in more urban areas now, the bird-friendly cities. And so that's a really great group to work with as well. But in short, for education and outreach, you really need to know your audience and provide the resources to that audience appropriately. And it can really, really help manage this situation. So we have great partners. And speaking of partners, the next section in the toolkit is on partnerships. And so establishing partnerships with stakeholder organizations is super important to achieving these conservation aims. And you want to build good relationships, prevent misunderstandings, foster mutual trust. And in this case, the partnerships for domestic cat management and control can form to address several different approaches or goals. And one might be animal welfare. As we've talked about previously, cats face a lot of disease impacts and threats, but also vehicle collisions. They prey from larger, they are prey to larger predators. In my area, we have lots of coyotes that cause cat mortality. So animal welfare is a good approach and a goal. And also, of course, wildlife conservation. Human health as well. A lot of these diseases are zoonotic. And so in forming these partnerships, they should be interdisciplinary and include people who have backgrounds in all these different topics. So for example, of partnerships, we work with people from Hawaii. And Hawaii as an island nation has faced a lot of introduced exotic species. And so they formed lots of different partnerships to address invasive cats. So the Cats and Wildlife Coalition, Kauai Feral Cat Task Force, Toxoplasmosis and At-Large Cat Technical Working Group, and the Lanai Cat Sanctuary. And this is an image from that sanctuary where cats are captured and then kept under human care in this sanctuary. The next chapter in the monograph and toolkit is focusing on integrated management solutions. And as I mentioned, the primary audience for this were for managers of land for native species. And so a lot of times they may face this situation and need to have an integrated management solution. So of course, the goal on these areas is to have no free-ranging cats. And so there are some management protocols. They should include prevention, so no free-ranging cats, monitoring to ensure there aren't any occurring or beginning to establish, and then control if they have established. And then in the toolkit and monograph, it gives examples of how to approach these different steps of prevention in the removing the food, water, shelter to stop the establishment of these cat colonies, public engagement, doing an inventory and monitoring, and then different control methods are explained. We also provided this decision tool, this stepwise decision process. So people who are managing these lands could get some advice on what to do in this different stepwise procedure. We mentioned again some of the regulatory and legal situations that may be faced. We gave a whole chapter on different suggested language and some examples, because some of these states lack necessary authorities or clear jurisdiction. And so it leaves room for states to start to develop and improve these policies on feral and free-ranging cats. And in the booklet, we provide common elements that could be included in this jurisdictional language. And we give examples from states and federal agencies that do have this language in place. So there are examples that they could be followed. And then in the monograph, we also have an addendum that provides additional work that was done by our legal group. And it provides examples of model policy and guidance. And so we are trying to give people a heads up and advantage if they are faced with this situation, so they're not left behind the 8 ball, so to speak. And if you're interested in all the products from the working group, you can scan this QR code here. And then the QR code on the right is for the monograph that I mentioned. I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have any.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Uh, will stay on a little longer for some questions. That was a great presentation. Your toolkit you guys put together has been really useful, and it's very expansive. And I've shared that a couple times now with members of the public. So great resource if you guys want to check it out. We have a few questions in chat, but one I wanted to ask is you mentioned some mitigation efforts that the public can do, like collars or cat bells. Do you know of any research done on the effectiveness of these kinds of tools?
We have some citations in the toolkit that can refer to some studies. Some studies have found that there is varying success in how they're used and what the situation is. And so I would say yes and no. And it depends on which tool you're using and the situation the cat is in. So I would probably put that as the last tool to use, probably not as successful as the other ones.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Let's see, other questions. We already talked about trap, neuter, release programs, but someone asked what your thoughts are on them.
Yeah, and I actually am familiar with some SPCA groups that are trying to deal with the issue in their city or county, and they are kind of exasperated because they don't have the funding to create these sanctuaries or keep them all enclosed. And so again, this is a human source problem of not getting the cats neutered or spayed. And so they end up with all these excess cats, and they go to this TNR, trap, neuter, release management method to try to begin to reduce the number of cats. But several studies have found it's not successful. And I think Elizabeth mentioned this too, is that it's very difficult to recapture these cats that are in those colonies, to make sure they're vaccinated appropriately, and to make sure there aren't any incoming cats. So in general, those are not going to reach our goal, which is to have no free-ranging cats. And so we wouldn't recommend that, but we do understand that sometimes that's the only option that a city or municipality might have.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that's a tricky problem. Let's see, we have another question. If you could expand or talk a bit more on toxoplasmosis. Someone asked about the ways it can be contracted, and if you know of any of the long and short-term health impacts on humans.
Yeah, that's a interesting situation. It's a protozoan parasite, and so felines, and so domestic cat is a primary host, and when they they can release it into the environment through feces and urine, and this is particularly a concern when you have people who have free-ranging cats around neighborhoods. And if it gets in the soil and people are gardening, you can get it on if you're on your hands, or you can get aerosolized, those little teeny eggs, oocytes. And so people can get infected with Toxoplasmosis gondii, and it can have an effect on reproductive success, and that's kind of a latent impact. But with some mammals, the marine mammals, they've even had mortality from infection with these oocytes. And so there is a growing body of research on the impacts, and especially in Hawaii, where you have so many rare endemics, it's become a real concern that's spreading into the environment like that.
Awesome. See, well, thanks so much, Sarah. I think we'll call it there. We're about 5 minutes over. So, Sarah, Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. Really informative and eye-opening presentations. thank you everyone for taking the time to attend today. If you want to learn more about our future webinar series, you can find those on our website. And just a heads up, tomorrow we have one on invasive wild pigs at 12 Eastern Standard Time. Sweet. Elizabeth, Sarah, thank you so much for presenting with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sweet. Take care, everybody.